Hi everyone and welcome back to My Hero Academia Podfics. Today I'm going to be picking up with part 3, chapters 4 and 5 for Why is Deku So Good with Kids. Really like this story a lot and we're going to just be continuing where we left off. Again, this is an 8-chapter fanfiction, so we're getting over halfway through at this point. Let me know your guys' thoughts in the comments below and if you guys have any recommendations at all for other fanfictions you'd like to hear. Chapter 4, in which Shota finds answers. Sort of. Shota stormed all the way to the 1A dorms. When he walked in, the students in the common room all fell silent at the expression on his face. They'd all been around long enough to know that expression meant someone was getting in big, big trouble. "It was my fault," Ashido said, breaking the silence. "No, it was me," Kaminari said. "It was supposed to just be—" "Are you kidding?" Sarah interrupted. "Totally my fault. Shota raised an eyebrow. All three of them fell silent, looking guilty. Apparently some of his students had broken some rules and grown a guilty conscience. "I have no idea what the three of you are talking about, but I'd love to have that conversation later. I'm looking for Bakugo." Everyone in the room pointed towards Bakugo's room, and sighing, Shota walked in that direction. As he left, the room lapsed into a relieved chatter, with more than a few of the students making fun of Ashido, Kaminari, and Sero for busting themselves. Shota knocked on Bakugo's door. A second later, the kid answered, looking annoyed. His expression didn't shift at all as he realized it was his teacher standing outside. "What do you want?" he growled. "I have a couple of questions for you," Shota said, crossing his arms. "I would prefer to have this conversation somewhere private, as Miss Ashido appears to be eavesdropping." He gestured down the hallway as Ashido gave a terrified squeak and her pink head disappeared around the corner. Looking chagrined, Bakugo opened his door wider and Shota stepped in. Shota closed the door behind him and Bakugo scowled. If Shota hadn't been so angry right now, he might have been impressed by Bakugo's stubborn drive to be angry at everyone, no matter their status. Why doesn't Midoriya-kun like it when people touch his shoulders?" Shota asked Bakugo, crossing his arms. This had worked as a conversation started before, so he figured it would work again, and he didn't really expect Bakugo to answer anyway. Bakugo looked extremely confused for a moment, and Shota used his silence as a cue to continue. "Why does Midoriya-kun have starburst scars all the way up his arms, and why does Midoriya-kun flinch away when you enter the classroom?" As he realized what Shota was talking about, Bakugo's face set itself in an angry scowl. "Ask him." "I did," Shota said flatly. "He refused to tell me because he was worried that he would get someone in trouble." He sighed, rubbing his eyebrows. Conversations like this were so difficult. Dropping his hand, he continued. "You two came from the same middle school, right? Tell me, how many years was he bullied for?" Mouth opening and closing a few times, Bakugo stood, looking like a fish out of water. "We were just kids," he said finally, looking at his feet, almost ashamed. "And he looked like he was quirkless," he added, as though that somehow justified it. Shota made a non-committal sound. This was really hard. He'd had this conversation with students before, of course, but Bakugo was so stubborn. It was hard to get Bakugo to listen to anything he said, let alone discussions of moral rules. "Look, I can't punish you for things you did outside of this school," he said, "but I would like to inform you that UA does not tolerate bullying, and if I catch so much as a whiff of you returning to your old habits, I will not hesitate to expel you." With that, Shota left the room. In the hallway, he pressed his fingers to his forehead, trying to banish the inevitable migraine that was coming. But it couldn't come, not yet, because he needed to look through Midoriya's records again. He must have missed something at the beginning of the year, because all of this talking he'd been doing made it sound as though Midoriya's quirk didn't manifest until years after it should have. Sighing, Shota started down the hallway. He could do this. He could find some old records of Midoriya Izuku and go through them. It wouldn't be hard. 10 minutes later, Shota was standing in front of Midoriya's open folder and realizing, in fact, it was hard, because the kid's quirk hadn't manifested until he was 15. 15! Midoriya was 15 now. He'd had his quirk for less than a year. Shota sat down at his desk and buried his face in his hands. What kind of teacher was he if he hadn't noticed that clearly Midoriya didn't know how to use his quirk? He'd just assumed that Midoriya had given up trying to figure out how to control it after the first time he'd use it, and so he had still been having trouble with it when he entered the school. But that was short-sighted, because Midoriya was one of the most diligent, hard-working students in the class, and of course Midoriya would have kept trying to use his quirk even if it broke every bone in his body. But having a quirk manifest at 15 was unheard of. The latest Shota had heard of a quirk manifesting was 9? 8 or 9. 15 was practically impossible. So what was he missing? Shaking his head, Shota put that aside for now. The important part of this was that Midoriya had been functionally quirkless for most of his life. It wasn't exactly common knowledge that the quirkless were treated like trash in this society, but being an underground hero, Shota had seen a lot of the discrimination. Midoriya... Well, it made sense that the kid could be jumpy sometimes. He probably had to deal with a lot more than just Bakugo. At that moment, Hisashi walked in. Shota looked at him with an expression of complete misery, and Hisashi suddenly looked worried. "Shota, you okay?" he asked, clearly trying to keep his voice quiet and failing miserably. Groaning, Shota slumped forward on the desk and dropped his head onto the table. Eyebrows twisting up in concern, Hisashi crossed the room, pulling an arm around Shota's back. Hey, what's wrong? What's going on?" "Do you know Midoriya's quirk didn't manifest until earlier this year?" Shota asked, picking his head up and giving Hisashi a miserable look. He was starting to go into a shame spiral, and the only person with any potential of pulling him out of it was the extremely loud man in front of him. All Might walked into the room, lost in thought. Both Shota and Hisashi ignored him as Hisashi pulled the folder out from under Shota's arm and started skimming through it. "Whoa, did you see all the stuff under health history?" Shota snatched the folder back, skimming for this section. Finding it, he read a long list of recurring issues, including anxiety, depression, trouble sleeping, panic disorder, and low self-esteem. Then he glanced through a shorter but still painfully long list of all the times Midoriya had gone to the doctor for help with burns and cuts. "Holy shit," Hisashi said from over Shota's shoulder. He'd apparently been reading right along with him. "I think," Shota said gravely, "that maybe we should have paid more attention to Midoriya Izuku." "Why?" All Might asked from across the room, suddenly looking very interested in their conversation. Hesitating a little, Shota handed the folder over to All Might. While the man was a lot more subtle and good at keeping secrets in his skeletal form, it was still hard to trust such an unsubtle guy with delicate information. All Might leafed through the folder, looking like it was nothing he hadn't seen before. He didn't look surprised at Midoriya's age and manifestation, and he didn't even blink at the long list of health issues. When he was done, he frowned at Shota, looking a little confused. "I don't see what's so wrong with all of this," he said. He sounded as though he legitimately didn't understand why Shota was upset. Hisashi started scolding him immediately, saving Shota from making some biting comments, which he'd inevitably have to apologize for later. "What do you mean you don't see what's wrong with it? There are clearly many issues that need to be talked about and addressed, like the clear health history that he has with bullying, and also that he didn't have a quirk until he was 15, and that he has recurring episodes of anxiety and—" No, All Might said, waving his hands in front of himself defensively. "That's not what I meant." Hisashi pursed his lips together, watching All Might angrily, as though daring him to take a wrong step in his next sentence. Shota felt curious about what All Might had meant, because there weren't a lot of ways to misinterpret his original statement. "I just meant," he scratched the back of his neck thoughtfully. I thought everybody already knew all that," he said, ending with a hesitant tilt to his voice. "It's pretty obvious how inexperienced Midoriya is with his quirk, and he's flinchy enough to see the anxiety and panic problems. Plus, it doesn't take much to notice how he sleeps. Anyone who's trained him knows he's naturally skittish, most likely from past bullying. I guess I thought all of that was common knowledge already, so I thought you'd seen something new in his folder when you were talking about it, that's all." He looked almost sheepish. Shota wanted to hit him. How did he miss all this stuff about Midoriya if All Might, the most unobservant hero in Japan's history, had noticed it? How, when Midoriya's homeroom teacher, had he missed all of these issues? Which seemed to not be a problem at all for All Might. It was annoying. And also, more annoying was that All Might had known about all the issues and hadn't actually done anything about it. Taking the folder back wordlessly, Shota snapped it shut and put it away. He was just leaving when something clicked in his brain, because honestly, All Might was not observant enough to realize that without paying a lot of attention. You really watch that kid, don't you? Shota asked, turning his heel to look at All Might. Why do you pay so much attention to him? All Might turned bright red, muttered something about an interesting quirk, and fled the room. So, All Might knew something too. Shota sighed. His life was becoming infinitely more difficult. That wraps up Chapter 4. Just going to jump in and just go ahead and continue on with Chapter 5, titled, In Which Midoriya Has a Bad Day. Midoriya was having a bad day. That was the first thing Shota noticed when he walked into the class the next morning, doing his usual observance of the class from the door. And from his quick glance, he could tell Midoriya was struggling. A few days ago, he probably wouldn't have noticed. Midoriya was skilled at hiding his true feelings. Shota had learned that much. But all Eri's ramblings and all the time he spent thinking about Midoriya the afternoon before made him highly attuned to Midoriya's tells. So the moment he walked into the room, he could tell something was off with him. Bakugo was grumbling about something to Kirishima in front of Midoriya, and every few seconds he would fling out a hand or yell louder, and Midoriya would flinch, face tensing up. Midoriya seemed to be aware that he was having a hard time. He was taking deep breaths with his eyes halfway closed, and kept clenching and relaxing his hands, clearly trying to get himself out of this funk. Satisfied with his survey of the classroom, Shota stepped in and stood at the front of the class, keeping his expression tired and empty. Bakugo, switch seats with Uraraka for the day, please, he said, keeping his eyes away from Midoriya as he said it, tempting as it was. Why? Bakugo said explosively. Uraraka looked confused as well, but she started to pack her stuff into her bag. Because I said so, he said simply. Grumbling an incoherent string of swear words, Bakugo grabbed his stuff and stalked back to Uraraka's desk on the other side of the classroom. Some of the tension in Midoriya's shoulders released, and he gave Uraraka a wilted smile as she sat down in front of him. Class went by quickly. Midoriya was quieter than usual, and when he did answer questions, he seemed to hesitate a lot more than he usually did. A few times Shota caught him jerking his head to the side as though to shake off bad thoughts, and the class was started to get ready to go to lunch, talking excitedly about whatever teenagers talked about these days. Shota called, Midoriya-kun, could you stay after class for a few minutes? Midoriya's shoulders tensed up, and about half the class turned to look at him, so Shota added, I have something I want to talk to you about for Eri. It wasn't exactly a lie, but it was enough that Midoriya relaxed a bit and nodded. After the class had completely left and Shota had ensured that no one was eavesdropping, he came back to the front of the classroom and asked bluntly, Are you having a bad day? Looking a little confused, Midoriya shrugged and then almost imperceptibly jerked his head into a nod. It's fine, he said, sounding at least like he really did think it was fine. I've had worse, and it was nice having Kachan across the... His expression grew suspicious. You did that on purpose. Returning the shrug, Shota answered, Maybe. They stayed silent for what felt like a long time, Midoriya examining his fingers on the desk and Shota watching him carefully. So what's wrong? With a sharp bang that almost made Shota jump, Midoriya's head fell onto his desk. He stayed there, forehead pressed against the wood. Shota stayed still and quiet, not really sure if now was the time to say anything at all. Do you like me? Midoriya mumbled finally, sounding defeated in a way that Shota had never heard him sound before. Well, what a hard question to answer. The short answer was of course Shota liked Midoriya. The kid was too cute and cuddly for anyone sane not to like him. But in order to preserve his reputation in the eyes of the students and faculty, and joke if she ever got wind of it, Shota always did his best to treat his students distantly. But as Shota was starting to realize more and more, Midoriya could keep a secret. I like you a lot, Midoriya. You're compassionate and smart and brave, and I admire all those traits. Silence fell again as Midoriya considered that. Shota wasn't sure if he said the right thing. It had been a while since a student so bluntly asked him what he thought of them, and Midoriya seemed so fragile right now with all his protective walls, so easy to bypass with the slightest miswording. Would you still like me if I was quirkless? Midoriya said numbly into the desk. Shota wasn't sure if he'd heard that right. What? If I was quirkless, Midoriya said, lifting his head with a pained look in his eyes. Would you still like me? Well, there was a lot to unpack in that statement, to be sure, but for now, of course I would still like you. Quirks don't make a person. Midoriya looked like he didn't know what to do with that. Shota sighed, deciding the best way to fix this would be to get Midoriya to find the right answer himself. Look, Hitoshi Shinso has a really bad quirk, right? No, Midoriya yelled, anger flaring up so fast that Shota could almost look alarmed. He honestly hadn't expected such a visceral reaction. Shinzo-kun has an amazing quirk. Right, Shota said, wincing internally. That's not what I meant. I meant his quirk isn't physical. It's not the typical hero quirk. Midoriya gave him a sharp nod, still glaring, though. But you still like Shinzo, right? Yes, Midoriya explained, excited light coming into his eyes. He can be super sarcastic sometimes, and it's mean, but it's also really funny. And he has such a dead sense of humor, and he's also really good at keeping calm under pressure, keeping up the appearance of being unfazed by everything, which is really cool, especially because he probably went through a lot of bullying because of his quirk. And also, slow down, Shota grumbled. Alarmed, Midoriya slapped his hands over his mouth, whispering, sorry. Shota took this opportunity to nudge things back on track. So you still like Shinzo, even though he has a non-heroic quirk. Tipping his head to the side, Midoriya frowned. Well, Shinzo-kun's quirk is really good for heroism, especially if he could get in on hostage situations or even just any fight at all. Plus, he's really, really helpful for calming people down after a traumatic incident, so I wouldn't say it's really a non-heroic quirk, but stereotypically his quirk is non-heroic, I guess, and I still like him, yeah. So then why on earth would I stop liking you if you didn't have a quirk? Your quirk has nothing to do with who you are as a person. If Uraraka suddenly got a new quirk like Black Whip, would you stop liking her? Midoriya shook his head. Shota frowned over the empty desks. Having a quirk is sort of like having a muscle. If you have a super strong muscle or a super weak muscle, it doesn't change how much people like you. The same goes for having a quirk. But I don't have the muscle at all, Midoriya said. Shota gave him a sharp look. You don't? Suddenly realizing what he'd said, Midoriya turned bright red and started stammering. I mean, I do now. In this very extremely hypothetical situation, I don't. Shota sighed. I know all about your quirk. Midoriya's eyes widened. You mean All Might told you to? What? What did All Might have to do with any of this? Eyebrows furrowing in confusion, Shota repeated. All Might? A look of horror crossed Midoriya's face, and he slammed his head into the desk before grabbing his stuff and fleeing from the room, expertly avoiding Shota's capture weapon as he muttered an apology and disappeared. Well, shit, Shota told the empty classroom. That definitely could have gone better. Sighing, he grabbed his phone and typed in a number he'd memorized last night. He probably should have done this sooner, but he really hadn't wanted to bother her so late at night, and also, he'd heard she could be overprotective, and he didn't want her storming into UA. The phone call rang a few times, and then a very confused-sounding voice answered. Hello? Hello, my name is Aizawa Shota. Is this Midoriya Inko speaking? And that concludes us for Chapter 5 on Why is Deku So Good with Kids. I really hope you guys enjoyed this one. I think these 2 chapters were really great, really getting Aizawa to a point where he's starting to understand his problem child a little bit better. So in the next part, I'll be continuing on with this series. We only have a few more to go. Let me know any thoughts you guys have or reactions to this, and be sure to drop any fic recommendations you have in the comments below. Thanks so much.